Good afternoon, everyone. Today, Victoria Samushak, EPM Managed Services Senior Client Manager at Alethea, is going to kick off the second webinar in our Managed Services Monthly Education Series, EPBCS and Essbase Application Optimization. For a bit of background, here at Alethea, we have 320 plus professionals with more than 23 years of experience providing the full Oracle suite of services, EPM, ERP, SCM, and HCM across various industries, including financial services, healthcare, high tech, professional services, and more. Alethea is not only an Oracle partner, but we are also an Oracle ERP, EPM, and HCM customer. Because we run our business on Oracle Cloud, our team of experts is here to understand and provide the right solutions to help meet the needs of over 1,000 clients and counting. Our managed services team is a dedicated practice of Oracle certified consultants, 100% Oracle Cloud focused on sustainment services to provide support, training, testing, administration, enhancements, and reporting. We really appreciate your participation in this webinar series delivered by our managed services team, and we will try to make time to address any questions from the Q&A chat throughout today's presentation. So with that, I'll let Victoria take it from here.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. First, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Then we'll look about some of the Essbase basics and optimization techniques. We will talk about some items specific to EPBCS, which is the cloud planning world. And we will touch base about the ASO plan type optimization, which is the aggregate storage type that automatically aggregates data for you without the need to run calculations. And then, of course, I will leave you with kind of the most impactful changes you can make in your applications to get better performance, and to leave you with some guidelines of how to better build calculations and forms to get the best performance out of your system. So as I mentioned, my name is Victoria Samushak. I have been in the world of Oracle for a little bit over 20 years. 17 of those years have been spent with Alethea, or as some of you previously know, Renzel. I started on the delivery side of the kind of application building and went through the full application development lifecycle, building everything out, testing, optimizing, and documenting, then switched to managed services, not only to keep myself busy, but to learn new technologies and kind of put to good use my troubleshooting skills and the optimization skills. So some of the items will be best practices today, and some of the items will be optimization techniques for you to review. Now, the intended audience for this webinar I thought was important to mention, and to me that is the level 1 and 2 administrators, as well as business analysts who are supporting planning and Essbase applications. Throughout the presentation, when I refer to planning, the concepts apply both to the cloud and the on-premise version of planning, but there are some highlights about the cloud-only features and some highlights about the on-prem Essbase features as well. Now, I wanted to make you a promise that I will not read every slide, but I will try to highlight the approaches that will give you the biggest return. And I have included some additional information on each slide in case you kind of want to read as I talk about what's most important. You will also be able to reference this presentation in the future. Hence, there's a little more information provided than I will kind of try not to read to you. So I figured we'd get started by looking at the most important player in the world of Essbase and planning. And to me, that is the Essbase block, right? And I use this analogy whenever talking to customers, that to me, an Essbase block is like a box of stuff in your garage, right? And with that, you basically, the size of the box is the block size, right? How full is each box is your block density. And then your index file is that list of all the boxes you have, so you know where to find your stuff, right? And so the official definitions you see kind of on your screen, but I figured the box analogy makes it easier to understand how to look at Essbase blocks. And then the most important moral of the story, and you'll see this throughout all of the optimization techniques, is you kind of need a box before you start putting stuff into it, right? So that's going to matter for how we kind of look at pooling information, calculating information, and making things run faster, right? Okay, so let's get started. Now that we kind of mentioned the Essbase blocks, let's get started with some of the basics, right? We all know that cache sizes are important for optimizing Essbase performance, right? Especially in the world of on-prem. In the cloud, it's managed more by Oracle. However, it's nice to understand what each cache size is. And the one that I want to kind of draw the most attention to is the data cache, because that is the most important one used in retrievals and calculations, and gives you basically the size of your garage that you can put your boxes into, right? So I put that the sky's the limit for that one. It depends on how much memory you have available, etc. But that's the one, if you ask me, out of the three, what gives you the biggest bang for your buck is the one that I would kind of focus on. Now, on the outline side, we've all heard that hourglass format is kind of the best design. And what that means is that you put your largest dense dimensions at the top of the outline, and then your largest sparse dimensions at the bottom of the outline. Now, I have an exception to this, which is paying attention to your non-aggregating dimensions, such as versions or scenarios, because you might want to use them as anchor dimensions later on in parallel calculations. And so sometimes I prefer versions to be at the bottom of the outline. And then I just kind of give you an idea that data compression is important, but when in doubt, just choose bitmap compression. Now, when we're loading data into our applications, we really would like to pay attention to loading zero values into the database. Now, there's a difference in Essbase between a zero value and what is known as a pound missing value. And so pound missing value is blank, while a zero is a data value. So whenever possible, we recommend replacing zeros with pound missings in your load rules, especially for on-prem Essbase. Fragmentation occurs with time. It's almost, think of it like an unorganized person who said they put all the notebooks in one box, but then realizes they're all over the place, right? So you can check what your fragmentation looks like by looking at the cluster ratio in the Essbase administration service console. But it's easy to resolve it, or kind of help resolve it, by one of two ways. Number one, you can export all your level 0 data, clear the database, reload level 0, and reaggregate what is needed. Or you can add a dense member in the outline and refresh the database, causing a dense restructure. And those two will help you out with fragmentation as you kind of with time going on. And then finally, I like to mention this to be mindful of the amount of data in general in a single application. For example, you might have built your application in 2000, and you're now in 2023, and rarely folks look at that very, very kind of older data for analysis. And so a good rule of thumb there is, if possible, you can archive that data off to the server in a file, or if you're on-prem, you might be able to create a historical copy of your application. Okay. Now, the next area I want to kind of briefly look at is data retrievals and forms, right? And that's because they're very similar in function, right? So some of the concepts that apply for smart view data retrievals apply to the form design as well. The biggest thing I want to mention there is make sure that whatever your static dimensions, put them into the point of view of both the form or your retrieval. That way they kind of stay not in rows or even columns. And then when using the form design, just in terms of performance, right, be mindful of running business rules on save. And that is because every time somebody updates that data form, even if they're not fully done with their updates, if they hit that save button, that business rule will kick off and be running. Sometimes we recommend that clients put their business rules in a right-click action menu, which allows the users to enter all of their data, hit save whenever they feel comfortable, and then run whatever functions need to be run as part of that data form. The other big one is using suppression on the form. And sometimes clients say, oh, it's not possible because I'm just starting my forecast, right? And this is where I point out that a hidden column might be your best friend. So to give you an idea of what to use that for is, let's say I put volume on my data form and use that for suppression, because then my forecast will include only products that had volume in the past, right? And then dynamically calculated members, it's the same in your retrievals and in your forms. And it just means that they're going to take a little bit longer to be pulled up by the system. Finally, the big one, and the one that people usually focus on when talking about optimization, and that is calculations. Now, I have a whole section on business rules and calculations down below, but I wanted to mention some general guidelines. Now, some folks kind of forget what the actual calculation order of the outline is. So I listed that for you guys first. But in general, it is accounts, time periods, any other dense dimensions, and then sparse dimensions in the order of the outline. And that is why that hourglass design is important. And finally, the system looks at if you have anything tagged as to pass and comes back to that and recalculates. Now, when it comes to calculations, if you learn nothing today except for this, is please ensure that all of your dimensions are accounted for in a calculation, more specifically in your fixed statement, right? And then in the actual calculation section, so you might be setting an account equal to something that counts as well. But primarily, if you have a product dimension, make sure you make a selection against that dimension in your fixed statement. You also welcome to use parallel calculations where it makes sense. And what parallel calculations allow you to do is calculate non-related slices of data. So to give you an example, maybe a final version and a working version at the same time, instead of calculating it one after the other. And just in terms of accuracy, ensure that you are aggregating your missing values when appropriate, either through a setting on the application or a setting in the calculation itself. Finally, I'd like to leave you with this. You know how they say clean up after yourself? It applies to Essbase as well. And so we recommend cleaning up blocks and data whenever possible after you've calculated a data slice. Okay. Now, I wanted to talk to you about some of the cloud-specific features as well, especially those that help identify kind of underperforming objects in an application. And I want to introduce you to your two best friends, an activity report and an application monitor, okay? An activity report gathers a lot of the information about what's happening inside an application. And Oracle just recently redesigned the activity report to make it even better. And I think it is the most valuable tool inside an EPBCS application at the moment. Now, in terms of why is it valuable? Because if I am trying to see where the pitfalls of my application are, and who's not performing and which calculations take the longest time to run, right? I included just some of the screenshots for you just so you can kind of get an idea of what you would see. But it doesn't just tell you your longest running calculation, it tells you which calculations create the most blocks for you. Do you have any issues with your outline? What are the general Essbase runtime metrics and planning runtime metrics? There's so much useful information in the activity report that I very strongly recommend that you guys check it out. And it is under the application overview activity report section. Now, your other kind of good friend is what's called an application monitor. And really, the application monitor helps you analyze some of your forms, business rules, data exports, etc. in the cloud. I kind of want to focus on the business rules because that's where we gain a lot of the optimization time. And I just wanted to give you an idea of what type of information you would gain from an application monitor. So once you generate your report, you can start seeing some of the green and red highlights that might show you some errors detected in your business rules, right? And to give you an idea of what kind of information, once you start looking at the details, number one, I wanted to show there because it's the most common kind of an error that an application monitor shows. And it just basically tells you that you're fixing on too much information, right? That if you don't have an if statement potentially in there to narrow it down, you're going to run through a lot of data cells. But the other one shows you some of the more critical information, which is, let's say I've updated my metadata in the hierarchy, but I forgot about updating some of the business rules. This will quickly point out to me some of my missing members. And I think that's fairly useful as well. Okay, since I promised we'd go back to kind of the core of optimization, which is business rules, the concept we talk about here applies both to on-premise business rules and EPBCS business rules. If there's something specific for EPBCS only, I'll point it out as we go through this, okay? Like I said, I'm not going to read all of the information. You can kind of have this for reference, but the few items I would like to kind of focus on are this idea of trying to go through an application as little times as possible when completing your calculations. So what does that mean, right? It means having potentially a global fix statement that looks at your scenario, version, year, month, whatever else doesn't really change throughout each section, and then creating specific fix statements to do tasks, for example, for a subset of products or departments and so on. And that'll minimize that run through the applications for you in the future. The big one we've all heard, so I just kind of put it here as a reminder, is fix on your dense dimension, if on your, fix on your sparse dimensions and if on your dense dimensions. Just to remind you all that that's still kind of a good guideline. And then in terms of the if statement, the other reminder I wanted to put in here that please use it in your member formulas, not just in your calculation scripts, to limit the amount of cells that need to be populated, right? But the other part to this was the piece that I mentioned about the else. And then I wanted to give you an example of what I mean by that, to use the else statement to calculate your data. It is a great tool that instead of clearing all data up front, you can use the else statement to set a value to pound missing if it does not meet the criteria of the if statements you kind of used above. And it allows you to not have unnecessary either zeros or old data points left behind after your calculations. Finally, if you kind of need to attach a business rule to the form, I strongly recommend that you pass it all the point of view and even page dimension members to reduce the size of the calculation. And you can use that by setting up substitution variables and passing it values kind of when you run the business rule. Now, because I did mention that the boxes need to exist before you try to put stuff into it, I wanted to remind you some of the ways that you can create those blocks, AKA create those boxes, right? The most efficient to me is still the data copy. However, the new setting commands have come a long way. And then the only one I'd like to kind of say, please use with caution, is the new create block command, right? Because that gives you the potential to blow up the size of your database. Finally, if you do not need to aggregate anything in a business rule, then don't, right? If I'm not looking at anything at an upper level at the end of a particular calculation, then there's no need for me to aggregate at that time point. And that kind of talks about, minimizing passes through the database, which we looked at with the fixed statements. I wanted to include some helpful set commands for business rules. But really, I want to focus on using a at remove function to exclude some unnecessary members from a fix, right? So maybe you want to calculate 10 departments except for 2 in there. You still want to use the hierarchical member selections like at children or at descendants. You can use at remove to kind of exclude those other 2 members. I wanted to remind everybody the difference between an AG and a calc dim, which is an AG simply rolls up a dimension and a calc dim also fires off stored formulas if they exist. This is used a lot against a workforce application that has stored member accounts. Finally, you have 2 options for calcing in parallel. One is a setting command, and that's the one where I kind of said you need an anchor in the outline. Now, what does that even mean? Well, it means if I'm calculating one product and it is dependent on another product, then my product dimension can never be calculated in parallel, right? So that's where the example of calculating maybe multiple versions at the same time or multiple years at the same time, if that's possible, comes into mind. But also you can use the fix parallel command that allows you to fix parallel on a very specific dimension name and kind of the number of threads that you want to run in parallel. This applies if your departments, for example, are not dependent on each other at all, and you want to calculate department A, B, and C all at the same time. This, of course, saves you that calculation time and helps with your application performance. Now, I typically try not to include too much about the ASO plan type and optimization, since not everybody uses an ASO plan type or an ASO database in their application. However, if you do, I wanted to point out a few of the great optimization techniques that are available for you out of the box. Every single item that we're going to talk about on this slide is typically created in a job if you're an EPBCS or a script if you're on-prem and scheduled as a nightly job because it kind of locks up the ASO model, okay? So restructuring the database kind of relates to that, defragmentation that we mentioned against the main primary BSO cube. Compacting the outline, think of it as like zipping a folder up, right? It is making that outline size a little bit smaller, so less of it has to go into memory when it's pulled. And then the most valuable one, in my opinion, is the merge data slices in ASO model, especially with the option to remove cells of 0 value. A lot of the times when we transfer data between a BSO and an ASO model, some zeros get through. And so this is an automatic option available in Calculation Manager, for example, in EPBCS, or in the EAS for on-prem applications, where you can merge slices and remove zeros. And like I mentioned, the only watch out for all 3 is please ensure they're scheduled at night or run them kind of when users are not in the system. Finally, since all data in an ASO application is aggregated on demand, optimizing that aggregation process might help your users with their retrieval. So you can do this by either pre-aggregating some data with recommended views or enabling query tracking for your application so it can help you identify the most often retrieved data sets and then use those for aggregation. Now, the quickest way is, of course, to use recommended views. And what you're doing is just pre-aggregating some slices of data for the end user. But query tracking, it depends if the recommended views are not giving you enough results. Query tracking might be more helpful. I did put out some watchouts because query tracking is actually cleared through certain actions. And so when you're in doubt, just use the recommended views for that aggregation. And finally, if you're on premise, be mindful of your disk space if you want to kind of optimize aggregations in ASO models, as they could take up a lot of size, right? Finally, if you slept through that entire presentation, right, and this yellow screen kind of woke you up, I wanted to leave you off with, if you learn nothing else today, what are the biggest benefits in optimization to get you started in improving your application performance? Number one, block size matters on-premise and in the cloud, right? If we go back to my analogy of boxes, right? If my boxes are too big, I cannot carry many at the same time, right? And that's kind of where that block size matters for the large blocks. However, I also want to caution you against a block size that is way too small, right? Imagine if I had 50 tiny boxes, that's also not really comfortable or efficient to look through, right? So there's that kind of optimal block size, which I can give you my opinion. It especially in the, especially lately with a lot more memory available on computers, etc. It is about 100 to 200, K. I'm so sorry. I'm just gonna have a quick sip of water from talking that much. But yeah, find your block size that works the best for your application, because that's what is always brought into your memory for retrievals, calculations, etc. My second biggest benefit is making sure that every dimension is represented in your calculation script. So it doesn't mean that every one of them has to go into the fix statement, but it means that every single one has to be mentioned in the calculation in each section, right? What that does for you is, let's say I have, a dimension for entities, and they include states and cities, etc. If I exclude the entity dimension from my fix statement, it is going to try to run the calculation not only on level 0 members, but also on the upper level members that will later on be wiped out or recalculated with an aggregation. So if you can imagine, I am at that point wasting time kind of calculating those upper level members. So to me, that is another great benefit that you can apply easily to your calculations. And that also has that piece about minimizing runs through the database in the calculations. And what that really means is, instead of having a fix on every single dimension, calculating one account, closing your fix, and then opening another fix and calculating another set of accounts, just open your fix once, calculate all of the applicable accounts that are related to that fix statement, and close it out. Obviously, that's different if you have calculations that differ by version, right? But then you can have that internal fix I mentioned that will deal with versions and still keep that global fix to minimize the run through the database. 3 more left, and then I'll open up to Q&A. So please be careful with block creation. If you are not careful with block creation, you can kind of balloon the application size to some crazy amounts. And that is because the sparse dimensions are not meant to all be filled out at all times. And so, for example, if I use that at create block command and I force every entity to have a block, that's going to blow up my application. When you can load some data, use a data copy, try to see what you can use to guide that block creation in a more kind of mindful way, but just, be careful with your creation process. Use your calc parallel where applicable, right? If I can decrease the calculation time in half by running 2 versions in parallel, why not? And then to finish it off, I had to put one from the ASO side, which is try to kind of on regular basis merge your slices and remove the zeros from your applications. And I think that's all I have for you guys today. So I'll try to see if Mary has any questions in the chat.
Does not look like we received any questions this afternoon. So I just want to say thank you all so much for attending today's webinar, and a big thank you to Victoria and our managed services team. Please check out our website and follow us on LinkedIn at Aletheia Digital Cafe for updates about the rest of the monthly education series, other webinars, events, and more.
Thanks everyone for joining today.